Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I'm here with Chapter 3 of William Harris Arnold's book, Ventures in Book Collecting, and Chapter 3 is titled A Book Hunter's Garner, with examples of the gentlest art. There is no past so long as books shall live. Bulwer Lytton. I should advise any beginner in book collecting whose bank account is such that he must think more than once before paying a large sum for a much desired volume to keep in touch with dealers in ordinary second-hand books and read their catalogues carefully. Such dealers often buy family libraries en bloc, and in them sometimes find books of unusual value. On these and desirable volumes acquired in other ways, a low price may be put for the sake of a quick turn. Sometimes, in his ignorance, a dealer fails to recognize a rarity and prices it on the plane of the riffraff that is part of the stock and trade of every general dealer in second-hand books. Professor Charles Eliot Norton told me, when showing his fine copy of the first edition of Hawthorne's Fanshawe, "I picked this up from an outdoor stand of a Boston bookshop. It cost me 25 cents. It was a quick turn for an Edinburgh dealer a few years ago that put into my eager hands the very next day after he obtained it a first edition of Pickwick papers, a presentation copy from Dickens, to his intimate friend Maclise, the distinguished artist whose painting of the great writer is in the National Portrait Gallery. The inscription on the flyleaf of the volume, one of several which Dickens had specially bound in Morocco for presentation, reads, 'From his something friend plus admirer.' And here's the inscription here, and there is a word there I can't quite make out. In London a few weeks earlier, I had been offered a copy of the same book inscribed to a less notable friend. The London dealer was one of the best-known purveyors of rare books and autographs. His price was £180. The Edinburgh man was widely known as a bookseller, but with him rarities were merely incidental to a very large business in current publications. I paid £40 for what is now one of the stars of my collection of association books. Years before my steps led me to this topper, I bought in London at the auction sale of the library of Stuart M. Samuel a copy of the first edition of David Copperfield, also presented by Dickens to Maclise, and a first edition of Pictures from Italy with this inscription on the half-title, 'From his affectionate friend.' And there is the inscription reproduced here as well. The dedication copy of Pickwick papers, acquired by Harry Widener, now by his lamented early death, in the monumental Widener Library of Harvard University, may stand as the most important of all Dickensania. I count it a privilege to possess the dedication copy of the first popular edition, issued in 1847. It came to me many years ago for a small sum at a London auction. The printed lines of dedication read, 'To Mr. Sergeant Talfourd, MP, this book is inscribed as a memorial of friendship.' Below this, Dickens has written, and this book is given by Charles Dickens. In the volume, I have inserted this coincidental note to Talfourd. 'Mr. Charles Dickens will be happy to have the pleasure of dining with Mr. Sergeant and Mrs. Talfourd on Saturday the 22nd of May. P.S. Private and confidential. Mr. Charles Dickens feels it remarkably odd to be writing to Runkle Square in this polite style. Regent's Park, 6th May, 1847. The throes of the young author, Dickens was only 28, are graphically described in this characteristic letter to Walter Savage Landor. 1 Devonshire Terrace, 26 July, 1840. My dear Landor, Mr. Shandy's clock was nothing to mine. Wind, 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 always winding am I. And day and night the alarm is in my ears, warning me that it must not run down. When I received that swing-like letter of yours, such visions of Bath sprung up and floated about me, that I rung the bell for my portmanteau, and putting it on a chair, looked hard at it for 3/4 of an hour. Suddenly a solemn sound from the clock jarred upon my ears, and sending it upstairs again, I sat down with a sigh to write. Gravely and seriously, for it is a serious matter, I have been looking forward to a glimpse of you, were it only for one day, and am still looking forward, and shall be looking forward for heaven knows how long. I am more bound down by this Humphrey than I have ever been yet. Nickleby was nothing to it, nor Pickwick, nor Oliver. It demands my constant attention and obliges me to exert all the self-denial I possess. but I hope before long to be so far ahead as to have actually turned the corner and left the printer at the bottom of the next street. And then, in the meanwhile, when you have the grace to write a long letter, I will have the grace to answer it with one of corresponding dimensions. So take care what you do, and what inflictions you call down upon that poetical scene, on which be all peace and happiness and sunny light for evermore. Of course, the Dickens Clock was Master Humphrey's clock, first published in 88 weekly numbers. These were followed by an edition in 3 big cloth-bound volumes. My copy has the well-known bookplate of the author in each volume, but there is no other indication of ownership. The administrators of the estate of Dickens had a label pasted in each of his books certifying that it was from the library of Charles Dickens. While it is possible that this particular copy may have been overlooked, it seems to me more likely that some unscrupulous person may have taken bookplates from 3 less important books and put them into this copy of the clock. There have been instances of this sort. I hold the matter in suspense. As all Dickens collectors know, the volumes contain Old Curiosity Shop and Barnaby Rudge, which in all present-day editions are separated from the fanciful clock episodes. The familiar pseudonym Boz was seldom used as a signature to letters. How it originated is told in the preface of the popular edition of Pickwick. Perhaps it is worth while to repeat it here. Boz was the nickname of a pet child, a younger brother, whom I had dubbed Moses in honor of the vicar of Wakefield, which, being fastidiously pronounced through the nose, became Boses, and being shortened became Boz. Boz was a familiar household word with me long before I was an author, and so I came to adopt it. In my autograph collection, I have a bit of Old Curiosity Shop manuscript with this explanatory letter. To my son, F.J. Barker, Delaware, Ontario, Canada. I lived when quite a young girl for some years with the family of General Gabriel Gordon, Colonel of H.M. 91st Regiment, on whose staff my father had been. The General, then an old man of 93 and blind, lived at Ardwick Lodge, Manchester, and opposite on a terrace resided Mr. and Mrs. Henry Burnett, Fanny Dickens, with whom I was very intimate. Charles Dickens, just then returned, at the date of the autograph, from America, came down on a visit to his sister, and was present at the opening of the Free Trade Hall in that city, where we all made one party on the platform, where he made a grand speech, present also Disraeli, Cockburn, Bright, and others. Next day I asked him for his autograph, and he said, "Is there any particular sentence you would like me to write out of any of my books?" "Oh yes," I said, "The Death of Little Nell," and he most kindly wrote the enclosed. See page opposite. Fanny Barker, Fairview, Avonside, Canterbury, New Zealand. And here we have a reproduction of that inscription. Mrs. Barker was mistaken in stating that Dickens had just then returned from America. He reached England after his first visit in June 1842, more than a year before she had obtained the autograph from him. While on his triumphal journey in our country, he had for secretary a Mr. Putnam, who in Forester's Life, disguised as Mr. Q, is frequently mentioned and amusingly described. Years later, to this efficient companion was sent this charming letter. My dear Mr. Putnam, I have received your letter with very great pleasure, as it is quite delightful to me to have a new assurance of your attachment, and a reminder, though I need none, of your old fidelity and zeal. I have often travelled in fancy over the old ground and water in America, and have over and over again beheld you coming at dusk into the stern galley of a western steamer with a little jug of some warm mixture intended for my very little cabin. Sometimes, this present year for instance, I have had an impression that you would come to England, and should not have been in the least surprised to behold you bodily entering my study. Whether we look as we used to look, I can't quite determine. I am much redder and browner, and I believe that I was in those times more robust, less interesting, shorter-haired, a more solid-looking personage, and not younger. But I take great exercise, and am very strong. Mrs. Dickens is stouter, though not quite so well in health as she used to be then. Anne, who has been with us in Italy and in Switzerland, is with us still, and looks, in my eyes, much the same. They both desire to be kindly remembered to you. An immense sensation has been created in their minds by your allusion to your daughter, which has given unbounded satisfaction. I write from the seaside, from a fishing village and a small watering place, to which we generally come at this time of year. We still reside, however, in London, our headquarters being always there. We have 8 children and have had 9. A little girl died suddenly not long ago. The picture of the 4 we had when we were in America hangs in our dining room at home. It is in a gay round frame now, and has these many years forgotten the sliding lid of the box you used to take off before you set it up on the side table at each of the 24,000 inns we stayed in. I wonder whether you recollect the inn at Hartford, where the levee wouldn't go away, or at New Haven, where they kicked the staircases to express impatience, or at Columbus, where they came in arm in arm at about midnight, or at St. Louis, where we had, I think, a ball, or at Pittsburgh, where I recollect one man with very large buttons on his waistcoat, who got behind the door and couldn't be got out, or at Philadelphia, where a little hatter with black whiskers did the honours. I feel as if I should like to see all those places again, so much, and to have another ride on a corduroy road, and to sit at another very long table with nothing particular to eat upon it, aboard the Messenger. I see many Americans in London, and find them the good-humoured, kind-hearted people. We never quarrel and get along, as you would say, quite merrily and pleasantly. If I ever find one in travelling about, I try to make him more at home, in remembrance of my old welcome. Sometimes he seems disposed to consider me a sort of monster at first, but he soon gets over it. I want to save the next leaf for the autographs you ask for. Therefore, I will only ask you to give my cordial regards to your wife, quite a matron, I suppose, since I saw her at the Tremont House, and a kiss to the little girl, and to believe me always faithfully, your friend C.D. Mr. Putnam, apparently not content with the signature C.D., left undisturbed the first of the autographs he had asked for. All the others have been cut from the leaf and were doubtless distributed to expectant friends. Dickens is today, and has been for more than 80 years since, the posthumous papers of the Pickwick Club came before a delighted public, the most popular of all 19th century authors. Therefore I venture to add still another of his letters, a letter which is certainly a funny one. It was written to Mary Boyle, for many years an intimate friend. It came to me with an explanatory note written by the young woman, a cousin of Miss Boyle. Tavistock Farm, Christmas Day, 1852. My own darling Mary. No end of Merry Christmases and Happy New Years to you, my gal. Mrs. being out, I don't wait for her to write, respecting of the young woman as you proposes, for to make me acquainted with. But, my dear Mary, I do assure you that there ain't a many young woman as I should so much like for to know as her, which you will, I hope, my own tell her, that much from him as is still yourn, and knowing as you ain't no cause to be jealous, for all that I am certain beforehand, as I shall adore her, O Mary, when you come to read the last chapters of the next number of Bleak House, I think, my ever dear, as you will say as him, what we knows on as done a pretty womanly thing as the sex will like, and as will make a sweet pint for to turn the story on my heart alive, for such you are, and so no more at present, but yourn in Sir Roger de Coverley, and reels as long as we can hear it, and say to that young woman, my always embraceable Mary, as I hopes to dance with her, much, for I do appreciate on her, and likewise my rosy posy, for such it is well known, you ever must be, and let me see the man as says no to it, and it will be the worse, for is hid and no, and so I tell him, can did I have had cast I on pillars put underneath the dancing room, which will prevent you and her from falling into the kitchen, my ever blooming Mary. This is a kiss. And so that was quite the letter to stumble over. Dame Fortune has not favoured me with so many association books and letters of Michelangelo Titmarsh as a Boz, but as the possessor of the Barry Cornwall copy of Vanity Fair, the dedication copy, I might be content without more. Thackeray was born at Calcutta on July 18, 1811. He was only 5 when his father died. A year later, in care of an Indian servant, the child was sent to England to be educated. The ship made a brief stop at St. Helena. With his attendant, as Thackeray himself has told, he took a long walk over rocks and hills, until we reached a garden where he saw a man walking. That is he, said the black man. That is Bonaparte. He eats 3 sheep every day, and all the little children can lay hands on him. The ever-remembered incident was to bear fruit in after years in the famous epitome. He fought 1,000 glorious wars, and more than half the world was his, and somewhere now in yonder stars can tell, mayhap, what greatness is. The little fellow did not see his mother again until 1822, when she came to England as the wife of Major Henry Carmichael Smith. The boy was then entered at Charterhouse. It is interesting to note, at this old school he was proficient in Latin, with a particular fondness for Horace. It may be that this trend to his studies was due to the influence of Major Carmichael Smith, who was always held in affectionate regard by his stepson. 2 years after the lad went to Charterhouse, the Major gave him his own copy of Horace, which still bears the donor's armorial bookplate. At the top of one of the front flyleafs, in the young scholar's beautiful handwriting, is written with pencil, M. W. Thackeray, Charterhouse, 1824. On the title page, in 2 places, his initials are written with ink, and in the upper right-hand corner is the embossed impression of his well-known little seal. It is not surprising that after all the years since the book first came into the hands of Thackeray, it has been much worn by use, and the front cover is detached. I also have a book of Thackeray's college days, which suggests his liking for long country walks. This is a series of beautifully engraved country maps with the main roads in colour. It is entitled Carey's Traveller's Companion, or a delineation of the turnpike roads of England and Wales, showing the immediate route to every market and borough town throughout the kingdom. The little volume, printed on very thin paper of fine quality, bears this imprint: London, printed for John Carey, engraver, map, and printseller, Strand, 1st January 1791. On the first flyleaf, the young owner wrote, W. M. Thackeray, Colonel, Cambridge. I think that's what that says. It's hard to tell, but there is the inscription. My choicest Thackeray letter would have been published before now, but for a bit of luck. The letter was given in full in the page proofs of the catalogue of the dealer whose shop I happened to enter, just as the printer's devil was about to take the final revise to his master. In a moment, the precious letter and the deleted proof sheet were mine. Friday, April 9th. My dearest mother, we can't make out the Paris journey just now. Have to lecture on the 20th. Mind the proceeds of the lecture are for your ivories. I have promised Lord Palmerston to dine at the Library Fund on the 25th, and I'm rather anxious to repair my defeat at the dramatic dinner. Want to show on the 1 of May at the Royal Academy dinner, and to get time to go into the hospital with Thompson, being a good deal bothered at present by my old enemy. I'm pretty well on with my work this month, and have found it go easier, and better in general health too, I think. And this is all my bulletin. For is not there the day's work before me, and ought I not to tackle it? When it is done and I am tired, I don't like to write letters. You will fancy I am unwell. When it is not done, and to be done, I don't like to write letters. It reproaches me and says, Come, sir, do me or nothing else. And so we go on toiling and devising and tumbling and getting up again. I think it is good fun to hear the girls singing and humming down the stairs. And though silent and solitary and preoccupied myself, and seeming very melancholy, am not the least so, but in a pleasant, bearable, grave, grey frame of mind, considering life very tolerable. To be sure, it ought to be with prosperity and good children. Don't, in the kindness of your heart, propose the open carriage to Mary. I can't have any intimacy. I don't respect her, or regard her, or forgive her. She has been rude to my daughters, and rude to my mother. I don't harbour a pennyworth of ill feeling, and will do anything in my small power to serve the young ones or old ones of Hindford House. But friendship is impossible. Why, it's a perpetual hypocrisy not to laugh at that astounding hullo. Stop. Better to go on with the Virginians, number 8, than abusing your neighbours. I copied an extract of your Maria's letter to the girls, and sent your favourite Tom Fraser with the injunction, Put that in your pipe and smoke it. He says there will be no difficulty, and I told him to write to Maria and send her some money. W.H. he promises to do so. My adorer John Brown writes me that they will put me up for Edinburgh. I think I had best leave it alone. I'm afraid I am too old to speak now, but never having had a purpose in life or known what I was going to do until I was doing it, can't tell whether I shall refuse or accept or covet or don't care for this honour if it comes. Come, let us get. Thackeray made 2 lecture trips in our country. The first in 1853 was devoted to the English humorists of the 18th century. 2 years later he came to tell all the Yankees about the 4 Georges. While in Boston on his first visit, Thackeray went to a church of a Sunday and heard Theodore Parker preach with such satisfaction that he wrote this letter. My dear Mr. Parker, can you kindly ask your organist what was the air? I thought it sounded like Haydn's, which he played in the introduction to your service this morning. The air is so touching and noble that it begat a desire in me to make some verses, if I could, and I would be very glad to have the music at any rate for my daughters to play to me. This, however, is only the pretext for writing. I want to say with what delight I heard you, and to thank you for one of the greatest pleasures I have had in my life. The climax about Mr. Lawrence quite overcame me. I saw him and shook hands with him on the day of his death, and was struck with the sweetness and benevolence of his countenance, which is to smile pity and kindness no more. I wonder whether he heard yonder what you said of him. I can't help speaking out of the abundance of pleasure which I owe to you, and thanking you too for your kindness in listening sometimes to a man who is very glad to come to you for instruction. Believe me most sincerely, yours, W. M. Thackeray. Everyone has heard of Thackeray's broken nose, the result of a schoolboy fight. Once, when a rumor was circulated that Thackeray was likely to become an adherent of the Church of Rome, someone remarked to Douglas Jerrold, "They're romanticizing old Thackeray." I hope, said Jerrold, they'll begin with his nose. Satirical and sarcastic flings were frequent between the rival wits, but these were never the expression of rancour. On occasion, however, Jerrold will do more than show his teeth. This testy little bite must have left a lasting scar. Sir, I do not understand your note, nor your request, nor anything appertaining to you, and I must request you not to pester me any farther. Yours truly, D. Jerrold. This note and a presentation copy of Mrs. Cottle's Curtain Lectures are all I have of Thackeray's fellow contributor to Punch. The lectures first appeared in its pages. Thackeray could have had no more appreciative friend than the witty lady to whom he sent the message shown on the opposite page. There are many letters written by Jane Welsh Carlyle which are as delightful as any by the hand of a woman. I venture to interject a short one here. From the collector's point of view, I have never looked with favour on the answers to requests for autographs. As a rule, they are perfunctory productions. The reader will agree with me in counting. This is one of the rare exceptions. My dear Mrs. Allison, demands for my husband's autograph are frequent enough from those even who have not your claim of acquaintanceship, either old or new, but to ask for my autograph would never certainly have occurred to an ordinary mind. And I must set it down for an eccentricity of genius. My autograph, you perceive, is the worst in nature, having been taught to write at 5 years old, when I could only make the pen write at all by gripping it in my whole fist. I have retained this habit of holding it, in a modified form, up to the present hour, and besides I am one of those fated and fatal mortals, born to the havings always a bad pen. So it is a mercy I have done nothing, either good or bad, enough in my time to make my autograph generally desired. I am a bad caller, for I have no carriage, and never learned to walk. But if I find myself provincially in your neighbourhood any day, I will certainly do myself the pleasure of returning your long ago visit. Very kindly, yours, Jane W. Carlyle. While the Virginians was in course of publication, the London literary group was much disturbed by a libellous sketch of Thackeray written by Edmund Yates, the editor of Town Talk. By Thackeray's request, the matter was taken up by the Garrick Club, of which both men were members, and Yates was expelled. In the controversy, Dickens gave his support to Yates. This resulted in an estrangement of the two great novelists, whose previous relations had been most friendly. And I'm just going to pause for a moment because we do have a portrait of William Thackeray. Thackeray's incessant application to literary work told on his always precarious health. Yet, despite many warnings, he ignored the doctor's advice and instructions. He died suddenly on the day before Christmas, 1863, at the early age of 52. One of the last persons he saw, other than those of his immediate family, was Dickens. The two men had not spoken to one another since the rupture of 1858. Only a few days before the end came, on Thackeray's initiative, a reconciliation was effected. The happy event is graphically described by Sir Theodore Martin in a letter written more than 20 years later. There were no lookers on what passed between Thackeray and Dickens but myself. I was standing in the Athenaeum Hall, chatting with Thackeray. Dickens came out of the reading room, passed us quite close, and taking no notice of either of us, "There's Dickens," Thackeray exclaimed, and went so quickly after Dickens that he caught him at the foot of the stairs. He held out his hand to Dickens, saying a few words, and then Dickens took his hand. A few words, and Thackeray came back to me and told me what had passed between them. The speaking was chiefly Thackeray's, that the estrangement must not go on, that they should shake hands and be the friends they had used to be. Mrs. Richmond Ritchie, Thackeray's daughter, when here a few weeks ago, told me that when he came home that day he told his daughter what had passed, just as I had described the scene to her and the words he used. Thackeray's kind and affectionate nature suffered under an alienation from his old friend, and he could not resist the impulse to put an end to it by the generous advance to Dickens which I witnessed, and the motive to which I quite understood when he broke away from me. There you have the true story. One of the earliest publications of The Wizard of the North, and the first to bear his name, was a translation of Goethe's Gotz von Berlichingen of the Iron Hand. It was, as Walter Scott, Esquire, Advocate, Edinburgh, that in February 1799 he made his bow to the literary public. My copy of the thin octavo is inscribed on the title page. From the translator. One who is charitably inclined might account for the E in the ultimate syllable as a reversion to the Old French, from which we derive the word, although it is well known that Scott in his early days was somewhat addicted to poor spelling. Bell, the publisher, paid the young writer £25 for the copyright. My earliest autograph of Scott is a note written from Lasswade on the Esk, about 6 miles from the Scotch capital. To a little cottage here in the summer of 1798, he brought his bride of 6 months, and here he doubtless made the translation of Goethe's tragedy, perhaps with the very pen to the Edinburgh stationer sent as requested. Mr. Scott requests Mess Manners and Miller to send him per bearer a copy of the best girding calendar, also a quire thick post-gilded and 1/400 quills. Lasswade Cottage, Wednesday, 5 September 1798. The successful publication of the Minstrel of the Scottish border, soon followed by the enthusiastic reception of the Lay of the Last Minstrel, had so established Scott's reputation that the publisher Constable offered 1,000 guineas for Marmion, soon after the poem was begun, and before he had read a line of it. The first edition of 2,000 issues in 1808 was sold in a month at a guinea, and half a copy and 12 less sumptuous editions were disposed of before 1825. It is a well-recognized fact that there have been more famous people bearing the name of Smith than of any other cognomen. One of my Scott letters was written to a distinguished woman of this name, an accomplished English actress who graced the London stage for many years. My dear Miss Smith, my late engagements have made me seem very ungrateful, when I would most wish to have seemed otherwise. But I throw myself upon your goodness to admit an apology founded upon various avocations, literary and poetical, not to mention the daily discharge of official duty. As a sort of peace offering, I have to beg you to accept what I hope is already in your hands, a copy of my new poem, called by the hard name of Marmion. I shall be much flattered indeed if you like it half as well as my little folks did. The Panorama, your kind gift, which they have studied and quoted every day, since to the great edification of Papa, who daily learned something he did not know before. We have Mrs. Siddons here, I believe to take her farewell of the Edinburgh audience. I observe you have been performing along with her in town, and am most happy to hear, for I did not fail to inquire, that you sustain the comparison as triumphantly as your warmest friends could wish. I wish London had been within 100 miles. I would certainly have come to see you both on the same stage. We have also Miss Bally here at present, who is certainly the best dramatic writer whom Britain has produced since the days of Shakespeare and Massinger. I hope you have had time to look into her tragedies. The comedies you may miss ever without any loss. For I am sure you will find much to delight you, and I venture to prophesy you will one day have opportunity to distinguish yourself in some of her characters. I mean, if the real taste for the drama independent is show and scenery should ever happen to revive, of which I think your being permitted to remain upon the shelf, as you call it, is a no very promising symptom. We have an actor here of considerable merit called Young. He is a well-educated and gentlemanlike man, and an enthusiast in his profession. I have sometimes had the pleasure of seeing him in private, and like him very much. Mrs. Scott joins in kindest and best remembrances, and the children desire 1,000 thanks, which they hope will not be less acceptable for my laziness. John Murray, bookseller, Fleet Street, has directions to send you Merriman. I flatter myself you will make inquiry after it, in case it has not reached you before this letter. I have some hopes to be in town this spring, when I will seek an early opportunity to express personally how much I am your faithful and affectionate friend, Walter Scott. Eden, 4th March. Letters of invitation are such pleasant communications that I seldom let pass an opportunity to add one to my collection. This one to William Stuart Rose, an old friend and frequent visitor, shows the veiled prophet in his most genial and always hospitable character. My dear Rose, devil take you for telling Lady Davy, but do not suppose the mischief is more than a little bit of curse may be appropriate to. My only reason for keeping the character of the veiled prophet is the number of kind friends who will write to me on the subject. My last unsaid my purpose, and left you to your own course of coming hither, which I supposed would be by the lakes. For myself, I would greatly have preferred steaming in it, or stewing in it, had it been cheaper, for I have an utter contempt of parade and travelling, and always take the cheapest way. You must come to Lythe by stream. I believe the boats are now started, and you are to be Lockhart's guest. They have a large house, and are delighted at the thought of seeing you, and you will proceed to Abbotsford, and so to St. Mary's, with all ease and speed. I charge you to reverse Iago's rule, and put no more money in your purse than will pay your passage. It is a useless commodity in the land of green hills and waters blue, grey plaids and Tory woo. I am truly sorry for Lydia's bad health. She has so much that is really amiable about her. I wish to God she would come down in the autumn and try quiet living with us for a little while. She grinds the edge of life so sharp that she must needs impair the substance. If the steam is not working, you will find the ordinary Lythe smacks decently fitted up, and capital sailing, but you will involve yourself in trouble if you attempt any other port than Lythe, and you must come direct to John Lockhart's 25th Northumberland Street. I will never forgive you if you make au faucon about this. You know my daughter's house is my own, especially as my own is straitened at present by sacrifice of our spare bedroom to enlarge my premises for receiving the philosophers. Sophia is also quite well. I had a dinner of the Celtic Society yesterday, i.e. I presided there, and the yells, yowls, pipe screaming, and the ear-splitting sound baffled all description. However, the waving of plaids of all hues, and checks dancing of feathers, and glistening of steel baldricks, silver chains, dirks, and pistols made up for it. N.B. I drank 2 bottles of claret, with head neither sorry nor sore, the first time this dozen of years, no, nor giddy either. I have the manuscript packed up, which Lady Holland wished to see upon the affair of 1715. The reading 3 pages of it yesterday aloud would have procured me with 3 dirks in my bosom at the least. Will you inquire to Lady H, with my most respectful compliments, how I shall send it to her ladyship? I mean to what places in town. The booksellers would be best, I suppose. I should be loth were there a chance of miscarriage. I will be proud to accept Mrs. Rose's hospitality in case I do, after all, make a start for the convention, but I fear there is little chance of it now, if I do intend to steam it. Addio, cara Rosa W. Scott. Come in your carriage, or come in a hack, come in the mail, or come in the smack, come by the steamboat, or by the shootry track, come as you will, only come in a crack, and be above all in no haste to go back. 26 May. Too late for post-booking. Let us know your day of sailing. When George IV arrived at the port of Lythe on his journey to Edinburgh in the month of August 1822, Scott, in the midst of rain, was rowed to the royal yacht. What! Exclaimed His Majesty Sir Walter Scott, the man in Scotland I most wish to see. Lockhart relates that when Scotch... Fuck me. 26 May, too late for post-booking. Let us know your day of sailing. When George VI arrived at the port of Lath on his journey to Edinburgh in the month of August 1822, Scott, in the midst of rain, was rowed to the royal yacht. What? Exclaimed His Majesty. Sir Walter Scott, the man in Scotland I most wish to see. Lockhart relates that when Scott reached the quarterdeck, the king called for a bottle of Highland whisky, and having drunk his health, desired a glass to be filled for him. Sir Walter, after draining his own bumper, made a request that the king should condescend to bestow on him the glass out of which His Majesty had just drunk his health, and this being granted, the precious vessel was immediately wrapped up and carefully deposited in what he conceived to be the safest part of his dress. On arrival home, he unexpectedly found there the poet Crabe. Scott, wet and hurried, embraced the venerable man with brotherly affection. The royal gift was forgotten. The ample skirt of the coat within which it had been packed, and which he had hitherto held cautiously in front of his person, slipped back to its more usual position. He sat down beside Crabbe, and the glass was crushed to atoms. He must have been in a far different spirit from that of the recipient of a baronsry bestowed by the Hanoverian king, that Scott, probably at a much earlier day, wrote the following Jacobite ballad. And here we have a facsimile of that ballad in a cursive writing so cramped that I can't even begin to read it myself. But that does bring us to the end of chapter 3.